Hello, my name is Jonathan Wyner. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Are You Listening? Feel free to go to the iZotope.com website. There are lots of educational materials there. You can download a copy of Ozone. For this segment, we're going to be talking about compression. Compression's hard. It is one of the hardest things to learn to work with. It took me quite a while before I felt like I had a handle on hearing it and using it. When you're hearing compression, very often you're hearing the absence of something as opposed to the presence of something. And so it just takes a little bit of training and time. You should understand that compression doesn't play a role in every mastering session. Not every song needs it. The best gain control in the context of music production is usually that takes place using a fader. Gain riding is awesome. It's very high fidelity. There's no artifacts. There's no color from it. And then compressing and controlling the dynamics and dynamicism of elements within your mix is really the best way to go. And most engineers that I've worked with who have been working at their craft for a long period of time spend most of their time compressing, if they compress, in the channel or maybe on a sub bus for individual instruments. There are exceptions to this. I know Sylvia Massey is a huge proponent of setting up her control on the mix bus and mixing to it. So there's no right way to do it or wrong way to do it. But even in that case, you've got the compressor on the mix bus and you can mix into it. In mastering, everything's fully baked. So if we try to use a heavy hand with compression in one section of a song, chances are it won't work as well in the next. Having said that, sometimes we do need to use compression to help us manage in a subtle way the relationship between elements in a mix, maybe get a little bit more punch or smooth out the sound or reconcile differences from section to section. Sometimes in mastering, we're even just doing gain riding, going from one section to the next. So here are some thoughts and ideas about using compression in mastering. Compressors are different from limiters in that they let you work with longer time frames. Limiters are really a safety to prevent you from overmodulating. Compressors, because they will, the release time of a compressor might be fractions of a second rather than milliseconds, if you will. They map better to musical signals, anything with sustain, anything that's got a note to it. And so if you find yourself needing to smooth out the musical dynamics in a track, a compressor is a much better choice for that. And this applies to mixing as well as mastering. Common myth number 624.9. Compressors don't make anything louder. Compressors turn things down. It's a common misconception that people think that in order to make a track loud, you need to squash it. It does make sense that if you restrict dynamics of a signal, you might create more headroom so you can turn the whole thing up. But really what you're doing is you're turning it down so that then you can turn it up after the fact. It's important to keep that in mind. Equally important is to understand that compressors will rob a signal of some early harmonics. And early harmonics often are positioned in the spectrum in a place where our ears are more sensitive. So a lot of harmonic content between 1000 and 3000 or 4000 hertz will give you more loudness. According to our perception, when you compress, you'll probably lose a little bit of that information unless you use a really fast release time or some unusual compressor circuit that adds distortion. Compressor's good for adding punch. It's good for adding glue, all of these things that I'll try to give some audible definitions to in some sound examples. But it's not really the thing that makes something loud. When I think about a compressor, I think about the way it helps you shape the envelope of a signal, the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, and release envelope. In some ways, compressors are like transient shapers. They allow you to modify the relationship and the sharpness or the duration or the energy at the attack of a signal compared to the decay and sustain, and to some extent the release. This is something you can certainly do in the extreme when you're compressing a bass to get more sustain out of every note that a bass plays. In mastering, we have to be a little bit more subtle with it. But I think by modifying the ADSR, that's where we come up with a lot of the effects that we're used to describing as a result of using compressors. The trade-off when using a compressor for me is between transient and sustain. And there's also a trade-off between clarity and density. If you want a record to sound clear, chances are you have to be pretty light-handed with a compressor. Not use very much, use very low ratios, long attack times, so that you don't ruin or diminish the ability to distinguish between one element and another in a mix. If, on the other hand, you want a modern pop sort of wall of sound sense to a recording, sometimes a compressor can be really helpful in just kind of bringing everything together and giving you what some people might call glue. When people talk about wanting to get a little bit more punch out of a recording using compression, in my mind, the way I translate that is they want a little bit more of the transient to come forward after the processing. So the recipe that I will use is a compressor that's got a longer attack time, lets the transient come through, and then the compression kicks in. I am going to set up a compressor with a fairly modest ratio. Actually, it's in mastering, it's kind of average, 2-to-1. I'll use an attack time of about 40-50 milliseconds and a release time that's on the quick side, which in mastering compression land might be 100-125 milliseconds or so. So hopefully, once I'm done applying this compression, you're going to get a little bit more of the thrust, the punch of the rhythm track, and compared to anything that's sustained in the track. So let's see if I can make that happen. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. Here you see 50 millisecond attack time, 100 millisecond release, ratio of 2-to-1. On average, we've got 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction. I'm going to start with the dynamics bypassed, and then I'm going to bring them in. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. So let's go through that one more time. Dynamics turned off. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. So hopefully you can understand what's happening there is the compressor's not kicking in until the first 50 milliseconds of the whatever's triggering the threshold. And 50 milliseconds is actually kind of an interesting number that corresponds to the period of a 20 hertz signal. So that means that anything that is present at the moment that a transient hits that might cross the threshold will go through a full cycle before the compressor actually kicks in and interrupts it. So in my way of thinking, there is a relationship between the low frequency component and the attack time. As the attack time gets shorter, it's going to start to pull back the low frequency transient, and then as it gets shorter and shorter, it starts to interrupt or influence the transient shape as one moves higher and higher up the spectrum. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that. I'm going to play that same section and bring the attack time shorter and shorter and see if you can hear that the kick drum begins to diminish and the transients in general start to fold back into the overall mix. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. I want to moonlight. And one more time, starting with it bypassed. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. As you play with that more and more, I think you become attuned to that relationship between the rhythm section and the attack time. The release time will also come into play to some extent. Obviously, a longer release time will mean that the compression is having more of a smoothing effect overall and have also an impact on the rhythm section. But in general, the attack time is the thing that really seems to have the greatest impact. Sidechains, like opinions, everybody's got one. Just trying to be cute here. You've heard people talk about sidechain compression, and most of the people, when they say that, they are referring to this colloquial idea having to do with house music or creating some pumping in the low end. But the fact of the matter is every compressor has a sidechain, and what you feed the sidechain ultimately has a strong effect or influence on the behavior of the compressor. In the case of sidechaining, you might take a kick drum and feed that into a compressor, and every time the kick hits, the compressor shoves the signal down. It's almost like an automatic gain control circuit or like a ducker. That's a very effective way to get that particular kind of sound, not something that usually happens in mastering, that usually happens in mixing. In mastering, often what we want to do with the sidechain is hide the action of the compressor. We want the compression to not have a sound so much as we want it to be kind of an invisible or transparent smoother and have a smoothing effect. And the best way to do that is to affect the signal running into the sidechain. The most common strategy is using a high-pass filter to remove some of the very low-frequency signals from the signal that drives the threshold, right, that affects the compressor. Signals that have more sustain or shorter wavelengths are the things that are actually triggering the compressor. So I'm going to exaggerate the effect of this compression so we really hear it pumping, and then I'm going to change the sidechain filter on the compressor, and you'll hear how the behavior of the compressor changes and the compression effect gets more smooth. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. So just to help you hear what's going on here, there's enough compression so that every time the kick drum hits, the compressor is driving the level down, and then when it releases, obviously you hear the sort of gain ride come back up. Pay special attention to the relationship between the kick drum and what's functioning as the snare. Without the compression, they're pretty even and level in the mix. When I turn the compression on, the kick drum's lower than the snare drum. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. I want to moonlight. Give that to you one more time, starting with it bypassed. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the... You can even hear the gain ride, the imprint of the compression on the vocals as the gain, the compressor action is taking the level down and then releasing and letting it come back up again. So the way to prevent this from happening is to employ a sidechain filter. There's one in Ozone here where you can run a high pass at various slopes. Let me, I'm going to solo the sidechain so you can actually hear the sound of the signal going through the sidechain circuit. So remember, this isn't the signal we're compressing. This is the signal that's feeding the sidechain that will actually govern the compressor. If I leave it set just like that, you can hear that the bass and the kick drum just don't have any play at all in the compressor, and the compressor would only be paying attention to the vocal. And maybe the snare drum. So let me turn this sidechain listen function off, and now you can hear the difference in the behavior of the compressor. I'm going to leave the high pass on to start, and then I'm going to turn it off so you can hear the A-B comparison. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. I want to moonlight. One more time. Start with the high pass on. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. I want to moonlight. Hopefully you can hear when the sidechain goes off. Every time the kick drum hits, the whole level sags. Two different effects. Sometimes you want one, sometimes you want the other, but this is a very, very powerful way of changing the effect of the compression on the mastering chain. So as I've said, compressors don't make anything louder. They actually turn the signal down. And the end result is that rather than something getting bigger, it tends to get thicker. So if you want to create a little bit of what I think some people call glue using a compressor, what you want to listen for is a lessening of the differences, the clarity of individual elements in the mix, so everything sort of comes together. We lose a little bit of the transient energy so we can hear the sustained energy a little bit better. So I'm going to play you before and after of this Color in Me track, and listen for the way everything gets a little closer together. You don't hear the reverb as well when everything's going on as you used to. You don't even hear the separation between the individual elements in the mix as well, but everything feels a little bit more together, glued together. So it's a small difference that you're hearing here. Again, in mastering land, we're looking at maybe a dB and a half of gain reduction at the peak, but it has a real effect on changing the relationships in a mix between the individual elements. And so it can be used as a thickening agent, but it needs to be used judiciously. If you start to feel like you're losing too much energy, or you're losing clarity, or you're losing some of the sharpness or vividness of elements in the mix, you might be compressing too much, or you can start playing around with settings. Use lower ratios, use longer attack times, shorter release times, and you can change other parameters also to influence it. You can change the shape of the knee. Hard knee will result in a harder sound, a brighter sound. And you can also change even the detector type. So all of these will influence the amount of smoothing that you get from a compressor. The knee of a compressor is something that's a little bit tricky to understand. Usually when you take a look at a manual for a compressor, you'll see something that looks like a rounded or angular shape that describes the signal level and what happens to the signal as it approaches the threshold. The short of it is that using a soft knee means that you're going to get more compression starting at a lower level and a gradual onset of compression, which results in a smoother overall sound. The classic compressor, the Uri LA2A, kind of one of the fathers of compressor types, uses a soft knee, and it's favored a lot for smoothing effects on vocals and signals that have a longer term envelope to them. A hard knee, on the other hand, will result in a very fast onset of compression as a signal crosses the threshold, which translates to a brighter sound. Usually it's got a little more distortion, and you can sometimes even hear the effect of the compressor switching. This is characteristic of the 1176, which is kind of the other great ancestor of most modern compressors. Many modern compressors allow you to adjust between a soft knee and a hard knee. My rule of thumb is, if I want a smoothing effect, a soft knee is better. If I want a hard knee, if I want to maintain the edginess in an EDM track or in a hard rock track of any sort, I'll usually go more for a hard knee because I don't want to rob the track of the energy that's kind of baked into the mix. If we want to get really nerdy about compressors, we also think about the detector type. There are different ways of measuring level, peak or average or something in between, and that will result in different behavior in the compressor. If you use a peak detector, it's going to be using, it's almost like a peak reading meter. It looks at the peak level in a very short window of time and uses that to to say this is what the level is now or now or now compared to the threshold. So a compressor that uses a peak detector will track very fast-moving level. Something that uses an average detector will window the level over the course of the classic RMS measurement is 300 milliseconds or a third of a second. The envelope of a sound that might take up a third of a second would be something probably that's melodic, like a vocal or a guitar or even a sustained bass note. So when you use an RMS detector, the compressor is more likely to track the activity, the level of those elements and those instruments in a mix. So the question is, do you want the compressor to track your drums, or do you want it to track your sustained instruments? Again, this works with knee and attack and release. All of these things come together in creating the overall compression effect. And if you're just getting started and just trying to sort of figure out compression, I would say don't worry about that other stuff. Stick with ratio, threshold, and play around a little bit with attack and release. That's a really good starting point. In the case of the Littrell James track, I probably would be inclined to use the peak detector because I want the compressor to respond very quickly to the rhythm track and therefore preserve more of the punch and the character and the sharpness, the vividness of the rhythm track. So just to remind you what that sounds like. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with a... Now this is assuming that this track even needs any compression. But in that case, that's the compressor detector type that I would use. In the case of the Color in Me track, I would probably use the RMS detector type, because in this case, I'm looking for glue that brings together all of the sustained elements in the track. You join your secret weapon. Now everything's in black and white. You join your secret weapon. So I think you can hear when I change it to peak detector, the compressor starts to respond to the drums and the sustained instruments sound like they're jumping around like crazy. The RMS detector really gives a smoother, thicker, fuller sound across the entire mix. Probably the area of greatest challenge to mix engineers is getting the relationship right in the low end between the kick drum and the sustained bass. It's understandable why that is. Our hearing isn't all that sensitive down there, and then most mix engineers don't have speakers that will give them a good shot at hearing energy below 80 hertz, at least not in a way that's even across the spectrum. And so as a mastering engineer, I'm often trying to adjust or reconcile or make that relationship better. While I am generally not a fan of going into multiband compression, there are instances where doing frequency-specific compression is called for and really helpful, and low-band compression is one of them. A low-band compressor is a very, very powerful way of controlling the low-frequency envelope and the relationship between the kick and the bass, the sustain of the bass. If I find myself needing to change that relationship, I will split a compressor so that I've got a low band and then everything else, usually around 150 hertz or so. And I will turn off the everything else band and only compress the bass region. Hopefully you can hear that. If you can't, it's probably time to get bigger speakers. So I'm just compressing that band, and by changing the attack time, I can actually change the relationship between kick and bass. With a long attack time, it'll let the kick come forward and compress the bass. And if I shorten the attack time, it keeps the kick in check. And so if we raise the output, the makeup gain of that band, we'll hear more of the bass. So let me try to demonstrate that for you, and we'll be listening across the entire mix. I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. I want to... So I'm going to play it turned off and then turned on, and I think you'll hear that with a fast attack, the relationship between the kick drum and the bass has changed, and you hear more of the note of the bass.
I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars. I want to moonlight.
One more time, starting with it turned off.
I need to learn to live life. I need to learn to let go. I need to learn to love right. I need a house with an ocean view. I want a fancy car. I want to live on Mars. I want to see the stars.
So if you find yourself constantly struggling with this relationship, this is a way to help you kind of modify that or adjust that after the fact. Thanks for watching Are You Listening? If you want to be notified about other episodes when they come out, subscribe to the YouTube channel and then you use the little bell icon. Feel free to go to the iZotope.com website. There are lots of educational materials there. There's the iZo sessions where you can download sound samples and experiment with them yourself. You can download a copy of Ozone, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Hope you find this useful.